minute warning, as it was given to me. Good morning again. It's time that we get started. And as we all return to our seats, we give thanks again for the ministry we share with the dwelling. This morning, we welcome our second keynoter of our 2024 Synod gathering. Let's welcome to the stage Iain Chester, ELCA Director for Innovation. As Executive Director for Innovation, Iain works with leaders and teams across the ELCA as they try new things and create a culture of innovation and collaboration. He believes that the church has a big part to play in the future of our world and likes to hear the stories of the creative ways people are making that happen. Iain has served with the ELCA Churchwide Organization over the past 8 years in a variety of roles, including manager of network engagement with ELCA World Hunger. During his time with the ELCA World Hunger, he worked with a network of over 2,500 congregations where all were fed. Iain is a graduate of North Park University in Chicago, Illinois, and enjoys watching soccer, walking his dog, and exploring local restaurants. Let's welcome Iain together.
Good morning, everyone. I'm just going to start my timer so that I know I don't go too long. My name is Iain Chester, and as you've already heard, I serve as the Executive for Innovation with the Evangelical Lutheran Church in America's Churchwide Organization, leading what we call the ELCA Innovation Lab. I'm joining you today all the way from Chicago, Illinois, and my family moved to Chicago when I was 13 in the 8th grade from Glasgow, Scotland. So it was a little bit of a culture shock for me. And as I was making my way to North Carolina yesterday, I remembered that in high school, a friend invited me on a family vacation to North Carolina. I think it was probably the first place that I had visited outside of the immediate Chicago area in the United States. And what I remember about that vacation is visiting your beautiful beaches, enjoying your beautiful outdoors, and going on lots of bike rides in the state of North Carolina. So I'm thankful to be back here and to be with you all this weekend, not just to share with you this morning, but also to hear about the life, ministry, and hope that exists in the North Carolina Synod. As I've already mentioned, I serve as part of the ELCA Innovation Lab at the Churchwide Organization. And I'm not going to spend long talking about that, but just to introduce myself and that ministry, here is how we describe ourselves as a ministry. We know that we'll never know your ministry, your community, or your processes as well as you do. But we're here to support you along the way, especially if you're trying something new. So with some introduction out of the way, what are we going to talk about this morning? We're going to do 3 things together. 1, we'll talk about some data related to hardship, loneliness, and stress. That's just to frame our conversation this morning. 2nd, we'll talk a little bit about design thinking with a particular focus on the word empathy. And then lastly, we'll try to put those 2 things together, relate them to one another, and go on our way. Another note before I jump in, I will ask you to talk to one another this morning at a couple of points throughout my presentation. So I just want to give you some warning about that so that you can be ready for that. I know you might have sat with your friends. I'm also going to ask you to try and talk with someone you don't know, if that's okay. And the second thing is I will use a tool called Slido during my presentation. You might have seen other folks use this. It's an interactive tool that allows a group of 100 or so people to interact with me while I'm presenting. I'll explain how that works when we get there, but if you have a cell phone, keep it handy as we'll use it for that part of the presentation. So let's get started. Part of our role at the ELCA Innovation Lab is trying to understand what's happening around us out in the world that might impact the life of the church, and how this might change the way we form community, the way we share the good news, and the way we serve our neighbors. One way that we do this is through research, particularly research that focuses on people who might not be part of our church already, or people who describe themselves as non-religious. As Dr. Augustine mentioned yesterday, trying to expand our we. So recently I was lucky enough to be part of an ecumenical research project with folks from the ELCA, the Presbyterian Church USA, and the Episcopal Church, who all decided to do some research that explored the lives and spirituality of young adults who are parents, or who hope to be parents at some point in the future. We undertook a national survey of 3,000 adults ages 25 to 39 who either have children or plan to have children. We got really good insights from the research, and there are a bunch of different things that I learned. But I'd love to discuss all of those in more detail with anyone who's interested this weekend, but today I'm going to focus on one particular insight. It's the one I thought most about when I first saw the results of our research study, and it's the one I've been thinking about ever since. And that's the fact that 71% of the people who responded to our survey said that life was harder at this point than they'd expected it to be. 71%. 19% of the respondents weren't sure. They neither disagreed nor agreed that life was harder than they expected, and only 10% of respondents actively disagreed. So 1 in 10 people are saying that life is kind of just as hard or easier than they thought it would be, but the rest are saying, this is harder than I thought it would be. I thought about it most, not because it was shocking or surprising, but because it felt true. It felt true not just to me, but when I thought about my friends, my family, my coworkers, my church, I wondered who would, no matter their age, say life was easier than they thought it would be at this moment. I couldn't really think of anyone. Perhaps only a child who is too young to conceive of how hard life should or shouldn't be. The truth is, there are so many ways that life can be hard. We might face health challenges, we might face loss, we might experience financial hardship, discrimination because of who we are or who we love. We may need to care for others at the expense of caring for ourselves. There's division in our communities, and so much more. But when I was thinking about what makes life hard, the first 2 things that popped into my head that might resonate with many of you, I thought of loneliness and I thought of stress. I think these resonated for me perhaps because of the stage of life that I'm in, where I feel stress creeping into areas of my daily existence that I never felt it before. That's a little scary. And then loneliness, because quite honestly, I thought I'd have more friends than I do. So what do these 2 things, loneliness and stress, look like out in the wider world? The research firm Gallup conducted a recent study that suggests nearly a quarter of the world is either very lonely or fairly lonely. That's not in the United States or in a particular place. That's a survey of a global population. I think it's 120 countries or something. Nearly a quarter of the world is lonely. And these 2 stats kind of blew me away. Some of Gallup's other recent research estimates that over 300 million people globally don't have a single friend. 300 million people don't have a single friend. And 1 in 5 don't have friends or family that they think they can count on when they need it. 1 in 5 don't have friends or family they can count on when they need it. Here in the United States, the Surgeon General has labeled loneliness an epidemic and has made it a priority of his office to address loneliness and isolation. Loneliness has all sorts of impacts on our broader health. It increases the chance of stroke, heart disease, depression, and more. I think it's important to note here that these growing trends in loneliness, they're not my fault. They're not your fault. They're something that's happening to our society in general. And there are so many things that contribute to this growth in loneliness, whether that's the way we use technology, increasing division, the effects of a pandemic, and so on. However, I think as Christians, we do have to consider what this means for us. What is our role? What is the role of the church in a world that is increasingly lonely? And then to move on to stress. I'm sure we've all felt stress at some point in our lives. Maybe earlier today, maybe yesterday, maybe a little further away. Whether that's because of the pressures of daily life, work, family, or other things. We all know how it feels to be overwhelmed by worry, to feel so acutely the need for a break. Since 2007, the American Psychological Association has conducted a nationwide study titled Stress in America. I'm guessing we do that pretty well. The opening paragraphs of the headline page for the study of 2023 reads as follows: the COVID-19 pandemic created a collective experience among Americans. While the early pandemic lockdowns may seem like the distant past, the aftermath remains. Further, widespread trauma has not been limited to the pandemic. Global conflict, racism and racial injustice, inflation, and climate-related disasters are all weighing on the collective consciousness of Americans. And this was borne out in their research. When you compare our levels of stress to pre-pandemic levels, it's growing in nearly every age group except those over 65 who remain at a really similar level to pre-pandemic. Again, a nation, and indeed a world, that is increasingly stressed, that has both faced trauma and is only just beginning to understand its effects, is not the fault of a single person. But what does it mean for us to be a church in a world filled with stress? What role should we play in helping others through those overwhelming moments? So I spent 10 minutes in my presentation telling you about how things are hard, lonely, and stressful. Perhaps not the uplifting start to the talk that you were hoping for. But this is where I'd like to turn back to the text for this weekend. I'm going to read it as a reminder. No, in all these things we are more than conquerors through him who loved us. For I am convinced that neither death, nor life, nor angels, nor rulers, nor things present, nor things to come, nor powers, nor height, nor depth, nor anything else in all creation will be able to separate us from the love of God in Christ our Lord. Now, I'm not a theologian, but the thing that struck me when I read this text in preparation for our time together is that it would be really easy to focus on that last sentence, the love of God in Christ. That is, after all, the news. That is, after all, the good news. But that list that Paul cites before he gets to that love, death, life, rulers, things present, things to come, and anything else in creation, that list is what stood out to me. Paul didn't have the internet or 101 research studies that he could reference in a presentation, and he's a lot more eloquent than I am. But I think that list could just have easily included hardship, loneliness, stress. Paul isn't saying that these challenges presented in life, the suffering that is part of our human existence, will disappear. Sorry, I lost my train of thought there. I can use that throughout. But I think that could have just easily included hardship, and Paul isn't saying that the challenges presented in life, the suffering that's part of our human experience, will disappear. Instead, it's that despite these things, we cannot be separated from the love of God. They will not separate us from the love of God. Hardship, loneliness, and stress, they cannot separate us from the love of God. As Christians, that is our message to the world. We are free to serve our neighbor. We are free to share the gospel. We are free. In a world that is lonely and stressed, in a world where everything seems harder than we thought it would be, are we sharing that story? Or are we afraid of expanding our we, of sharing it with others? So now I'm going to break us out into some discussion time this morning. So find one or two people next to you, preferably someone you don't know, like I said earlier, although I know that might be difficult given you've sat with your friends. And we're going to spend some time discussing the following questions. What are some successful ways that you've seen ministries or churches respond to loneliness and stress in their communities? If you haven't, why do you think that might be? And what stood out to you so far this morning? So those are my three questions for you to discuss together. If you're watching online and you don't have a discussion partner, then I've got a tool called Slido, which I mentioned earlier. You can use your phone or computer and go to slido.com and enter the code WeAreMore. Then you'll be able to type a response to the question, and we'll see it here in the auditorium. So for folks online, if you want to respond using Slido, you can. That'll be up on the screen in just a second so that you can follow along with that. And if you're in the room and you're having a discussion with a partner and you think, this is something I really want to share up on the big screen, you can go to slido.com, you can enter the code WeAreMore, and you can put it on the big screen. So let's go ahead and break out into some discussion. What are some successful ways you've seen ministries respond to loneliness or stress? If you haven't, why do you think that may be, and what stood out to you this morning? I can bring myself.
This right, where this.
We're going to take about one more minute. Okay, I'm going to ask you to wrap up your final thoughts. Okay, you've got 10 seconds. 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. Awesome. Thank you so much for engaging in some conversation with one another. I hope those were good conversations. I just want to go over a couple of the responses on the Slido, and if you want to, you can put in a response along the way here. But just seeing in a lot of these responses, it's often the way that as a church we engage with people in their daily lives, whether that's the ways that they're out and about in our neighborhood and we're engaging with them, programs for our youth and young adults, and partnership with local nonprofits and others. So thank you for engaging in some discussion. I hope that was a time together. So, we have talked a little bit about how, at our very best, churches are a place where the good news is shared, but also from some of those examples where our neighbor is cared for and where problems we face as a broader society, like loneliness and stress, are addressed. And while we just talked about all of the ways churches do that well, the truth is many people don't see the church as a place that's responding to them or as a place that's for them. And the research I mentioned earlier has some information that helps back that up. We followed up that research into young adult parents, I mentioned earlier, with some qualitative interviews, where we spent time hearing from young adults around the country. This is a quote from one of those interviewees, and I'm going to read it. Because I don't really see the church as a resource. I don't really see it as something that's part of my thing to even tell people. If someone tells me, hey, I'm really down on my bills, I need help, I'm giving them the resources to the local food pantry, I'm giving them the resources to the local health clinic. Churches just aren't on my radar as someone who's able to be a support and a resource for people who are in need. I'm just going to give us a few seconds of silence to think about that quote. How'd that make you feel? I think my immediate feeling when I hear this quote is to get a little defensive. To say things like, but the church was running the food pantry. Or, it's just that you haven't heard about my church. As Christians and as a church, we like to say we're really good at relationships with God and relationships with one another, but sometimes I wonder if that's really what we need to practice most. Only 17.5% of young adult parents have been involved in a faith community in the previous 5 years in that research study that I just referenced. And only 57% turn to a faith community to help them navigate through tough times. 17% of those folks found that community to be unhelpful. The same group of people who say life is harder than they expected don't see the church as a resource, as a place to find help or relationship. Again, I'll say that we as Christians have a message of hope we are freed to serve our neighbor. Are we sharing this? Are we serving our neighbors well? We call for right relationship. Do we really know what that looks like? And I'm not saying that the answer to those questions are all or always no. There is incredible ministry happening across the ELCA. It's my favorite thing about my job, to see that happening. I get to see it happen all over the place, and we've already seen it here this morning with us. But what does it mean for us to say, yes, we're going to tell our own story, and yes, we're going to tell the story of the church, but to also listen to the stories of those who are our neighbors, and for us to be transformed by the listening that we do so that we may be in better relationship with them. Well, in the second part of my presentation, we're going to talk a little bit about a methodology that we use at the ELCA Innovation Lab that I think helps us do just that. That methodology is called design thinking. Just a show of hands, who has heard of the phrase design thinking before? Awesome, we've got quite a few folks. That's great, and I want to note up front that design thinking is just a methodology. It's just a toolbox filled with tools. It's just one way of thinking about problems. It's not the right way, it's not the only way, and it's more useful in some situations than it is in others. But I think it's a powerful tool for us as a church, and that's because it starts with empathy. Now, I'm going to ask you all here and online to respond to a couple of questions in Slido. So if you've got a cell phone, you can pull it out and go to slido.com, and there you'll enter the code WeAreMore. It's okay if you don't have a cell phone, or if that doesn't work for you this morning, or if you don't want to respond. This is just a way to help us visualize what we're thinking in the room and for me to hear from you. So take a second to respond to this question when you get to Slido. What do you think of when you hear the word design? What pops into your mind first? Creative. Oh, plan and structure. Empathy, intentional planning, engineering, a user interface, art, craft, being artful, the act of being artful, to build. Yeah, remodeling your home. These are some good ways that we think about the word design. I'm going to move it on, so I'm sorry if it cuts you off from putting in your notes. But when I hear the word design, I generally think of art, architecture, perhaps graphic design, or remodeling your home, the latest tech product. But the truth is, pretty much everything has been designed. From bus routes to Bible studies, there was someone planning, or maybe a group of people, planning, creating, and developing the elements that ultimately shape the experience you have when you show up or interact with that thing. The Equity Design Collaborative is a group of people interested in the intersection of design work and equity work. They define design as the intention and unintentional impact behind an outcome. The intention and unintentional impact behind an outcome. So that's their definition of design. And they talk about designers as being one who uses their creative agency to address an issue, problem, challenge, or opportunity space. One who uses their creative agency to address an issue, problem, challenge, or opportunity space. The truth is, we are all designers. Think about the ministry that you play a part in, at your church or out in the world. And then think about that definition of a designer. What do you design? What things do you design as part of your ministry and as part of your church? We're going to go ahead and put that in Slido. So in your congregation or ministry, what do you design? How are you a designer? It's not good that my eyesight's not good enough to see it from here. Yeah, so everything from bulletins, the websites, our culture of welcome, designing a culture of welcome, curriculum, our kids programs, all the things we do with our youth, the way we have hospitality, looking for others to share their gifts. There are some themes that it's grouping at the top, like music, the programs that we run, and the education that we do as a church. So we design, and we are designers of a variety of things. And these are amazing things. Just think for a second about the collective creative agency we have in this room. All of the things that you design and all of the things that you speak into. That gets me excited. As we begin to talk a little bit about design thinking, I want you to keep in mind the things that you design in your ministry and the ways that you are a designer. What might change about those things if you applied the framework that we're about to talk about? What might change about those things if you applied the framework that we're about to talk about? So, as we think about the methodology of design thinking, we should be thinking of ourselves as designers. And design thinking is a method for creative problem solving. Design thinking works on an understanding that the best solutions and problem solving involve the perspectives of those who will use the design. This is often termed the user, but you might hear that referred to as a customer, a member, a constituent. By gaining a deep understanding of the user first, design thinking considers whether the problem is a problem at all. It helps us to uncover our assumptions about a particular problem or a particular group of people, and it explores the implications of a potential solution. To better understand the problem, the users, and the potential solution, there are 5 modes or 5 steps in design thinking. There are so many different ways. If you look up design thinking online, there'll be a ton of different ways that people describe design thinking and the modes and ways that you should do it. This is from the Stanford Design School, and they have 5 steps or 5 modes. The first is to empathize. Empathy is the foundation of user-centered design. The problems that you're trying to solve in your congregation or in your community are rarely your own problems. They might not be what you experience. They might be those of a particular group of people or of someone else. Building empathy with those people by learning more about their life, values, and experiences is really important. Empathy is about perspective taking. The define mode is when you unpack the things that you learned in that empathy phase, you think about the needs that you heard expressed, and you begin to identify a problem or opportunity that you would like to develop a solution for, a problem that you'd like to try and solve. Ideate, this is the place where you generate as many ideas as possible and as many solutions as possible in response to the challenge or the problem that you've come up with. And then you're going to pick a couple of them. And you're going to prototype those. Prototyping gets our ideas out of our heads and out into the world. A prototype can be anything that takes a physical form. A wall of Post-its, an activity, an object, one Bible study. The point of a prototype is that it's something you can test. It should be inexpensive, and it should be easy-ish to make. And then the last step is testing, which I can't get my notes for test. Testing is your chance to gather feedback, refine solutions, and continue to learn about how people reacted to your idea and the solution that you put together. Design thinking is an iterative problem-solving process, and it opens up the opportunity to think from different perspectives and in alternate ways in order to reach a better solution. Okay, I know that was kind of a lot, but if there's something I want you to take away from this idea, from this design thinking methodology, it's the idea that we should start with empathy. To think a little bit about what empathy is, I really like the short video from author Brene Brown, where she illustrates the difference between empathy and compassion. It's not an exact fit with design thinking, but I think it's a really good intro and helps us think about what empathy is. So we're going to watch a quick video.
So what is empathy, and why is it very different than sympathy? Empathy fuels connection. Sympathy drives disconnection. Empathy, it's very interesting. Teresa Wiseman is a nursing scholar who studied professions, very diverse professions where empathy is relevant, and came up with 4 qualities of empathy. Perspective taking, the ability to take the perspective of another person or recognize their perspective as their truth. Staying out of judgment, not easy when you enjoy it as much as most of us do. Recognizing emotion in other people and then communicating that. Empathy is feeling with people. And to me, I always think of empathy as this kind of sacred space when someone's kind of in a deep hole and they shout out from the bottom and they say, "I'm stuck, it's dark, I'm overwhelmed." And then we look and we say, "Hey, you can climb down. I know what it's like down here, and you're not alone." Sympathy is, "Ooh, it's bad, no, you want a sandwich?" Empathy is a choice, and it's a vulnerable choice, because in order to connect with you, I have to connect with something in myself that knows that feeling. Rarely, if ever, does an empathic response begin with "at least." And we do it all the time, because you know what? Someone just shared something with us that's incredibly painful, and we're trying to silver lining it. I don't think that's a verb, but I'm using it as one. We're trying to put the silver lining around it. So, I had a miscarriage. Oh, at least you know you can get pregnant. I think my marriage is falling apart. At least you have a marriage. John's getting kicked out of school. At least Sarah is an A student. But one of the things we do sometimes in the face of very difficult conversations is we try to make things better. If I share something with you that's very difficult, I'd rather you say, "I don't even know what to say right now. I'm just so glad you told me." Because the truth is, rarely can a response make something better. What makes something better is connection.
What makes something better is connection. There are lots of ways that we can build empathy, build that connection with those that we don't know. But some methods that you might have heard about before are things like focus groups, one-on-one interviews, surveys, or really just conversation. Anything that helps you understand the perspective of another person. Anything that helps you understand the perspective of another person. That's empathy building. When we're thinking about the empathy step in the design thinking process, we like to think about a few questions. We like to frame a research question. We like to think about, who do we hope to learn from, and what are we trying to learn? Who do we hope to learn from, and what are we trying to learn? Answering these questions will help you formulate a research question, something that you want to go out and learn and empathize with others about. And there are 2 examples of different types of research questions here. How do first-time visitors to our congregation experience our contemporary worship service? That's an evaluative question. That's one that's going to help you understand and evaluate something, and then to change based on what you learned. So you're going to learn about something that already exists. You're going to have some empathy with those that attend your worship service, and then you're going to make changes based on that. And then there's a generative question. This is the other example. How do older adults in our area experience community outside of the church? That's generative. It will lead you to insights and ideas from other places that you can then apply to your ministry, to the work that you're doing. So it's just a way to think about how we frame questions. So let's give this empathy thing a try. We're going to walk through a really simple activity together as an example of how to build empathy using design thinking tools. This is really just an illustrative activity, but if you wanted, you could use it in a real life situation. It's called a day in the life. And the way a day in the life works is the purpose of the activity is to visualize the highs and the lows of a particular event and identify moments of joy and or pain. We call these joy points and pain points that you or someone else has experienced. So we're thinking about a particular event, and we're thinking about the joy that someone has experienced, and we're thinking about the pain and the tension that they've experienced in that event. And that doesn't have to be big things. I think pain and joy feel like words that are really big. Those can also be small things. They don't have to be big. So we're going to try this now. I know that you might not have a writing utensil and a piece of paper with you. So if you don't, I am going to ask you to create an imaginary pen and paper in your mind. And for this activity, we have to pick an event or an experience, and it's best if it's an event or experience that all of the folks that you're working with share. The event that I'm going to pick for us today, which I know we all share because we're all here today, is yesterday. So we're going to think a little bit about our yesterdays. So if you were doing this in your ministry, you could pick any event that you share as a community. It could be worship, it could be Bible study, it could be the picnic that you have each summer. You could pick any event if you wanted to try this activity in your congregation. So either in your mind or on your piece of paper, you would draw a long vertical line along the left side of your page, and the top of that line gets a plus, and the bottom of that line gets a minus. The long vertical line with the plus and the minus is how we're feeling. That's our feeling or experience. And the horizontal line is time. So if you've got something to draw this, go ahead and do it now. If not, just visualize that in your mind. You can see it up on the screen, so this one should be kind of easy. Okay, so in just a second, you're going to spend a few minutes talking with a partner. And all you're going to talk about is their yesterday. That's all. There's no other prompt. You're just going to talk about yesterday. But try to ask some questions along the way that help them share their story of yesterday, that help you understand what they experienced. And as you're talking with one another, try to listen for moments of joy and moments of pain. And like I said, those can be big things. For some folks, they might be really big. Yesterday. For some folks, they might be really small. So listen for moments of joy and pain. And then what we're going to do, either in our mind or actually on a piece of paper, is that by the end, you should have something that looks a little bit like this. If you don't have a pen and paper, again, you're going to make that imaginary chart in your mind. But you should have something that looks a little bit like this. So for this person, this is not me. For this person, the workout was the high point of their morning. So we can think a little bit about that for one another. So we're going to do that for about 3 minutes per partner, with one person asking questions and the other responding. And I'll let you know when to switch partners. So find a neighbor and just talk a little bit about your yesterday. What was your experience like yesterday? You got about a minute left with your first partner. Okay, and if you haven't already, you're going to switch to the next person's story about their yesterday. Remember, you're listening for joy and pain points. Okay, I'm going to end your conversation in about 15 seconds. Okay, I'm going to bring us back together in 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. Okay. I'm glad that you enjoy conversation with one another so much, and it was a pleasure to hear some snippets of your conversations. And I know this might have felt a little strange, and perhaps maybe a little bit basic, just talking about our yesterdays. But I want to make the point that building empathy really is this simple. And I hope that you noticed that listening for the joy and the pain in another's story gives you, as the listener, a different perspective than you might usually have in a conversation. So what does it mean to be actively listening for someone's joy and for someone's pain? So as we close out our thoughts on empathy, I'm going to ask you one more Slido question. Whom would you like to build empathy with in your congregation or ministry? Whom would you like to build empathy with in your congregation or ministry? That can be a group of people, community. What might be a first step? What might be a first step? Yeah, building empathy with our youth, young adult parents. Yeah, with our new staff at our congregations. What does it mean to have empathy and understand the perspectives as new staff as they come into our organizations and into our congregations? New members finding their place, the same thing. Those we disagree with, that's a really good one. Trying to get at the heart of why they have that perspective. Yeah, I like this idea about new pastors, new staff, new members. What does it mean for us to build empathy with those who don't yet know our community? So I'm going to move us on here. Thank you for those. And I'm going to try to bring it all together here. So we've dug a little deeper on one step of the design thinking process. If you're interested in learning more about design thinking as a methodology and trying some of the tools associated with each step of the process, then there are so many resources available online. I have two places I'd recommend you start. One is IDEO, that's IDEO. They have an online design kit, and I think it's a really good resource. And then I'd also recommend a short book called How to Try. That's by the Reverend Lorenzo Labrija, where he translates design thinking into a church context. It's really accessible, it's really short, if you like short books, I do, but it's also a really powerful book. So just to take one more look at design thinking overall, if there are two things I want you to take away, it's to start with empathy and it's to not be afraid to try. Start with empathy and don't be afraid to try. So to close, I'm going to try and tell you why I picked hardship and stress as the framing for our conversation today, and I'm also going to try and fit in one more tool in the last couple of minutes here from the design thinking toolkit to share with you. So as Lutherans, we say we believe in a God of abundance. When I say that, I often wonder whether I'm actually saying that I believe in a God who was once abundant, or perhaps I'm saying I believe in a God who will be abundant again in the future. But we should believe in a God of abundance right now, today. When I think about a lonely and stressed out world, and then I think about what the church has at its disposal, I think about the creative agency that we have as a church. That is when I think we, as a people who should be in theory willing to spend time with a lonely world, I start to get excited. I see hope for our world and for our church. We believe in a God of abundance, and that includes right now. So this quick tool, it really is just a trick. Oh, we're not going forward anymore. Oh, there we go. We're going forward 2 more, I think. Sorry. 3 more. 1 more. There we go. So this quick tool really is just a trick, and it's called How Might We? By putting the phrase, how might we, onto the front of an insight or a thought, we create questions that are broad enough to include a wide range of solutions. If I take the statement, we need to have our Bible study on Wednesday night, and turn it into a how might we question, I might end up with something like, how might we learn more about Scripture as a community? I go from a Bible study, that statement, that's one solution, to opening myself up to a myriad of possibilities. How might we learn more about Scripture as a community? So how might we questions are short questions that launch ideation. They're broad enough to include a wide range of solutions, but narrow enough to impose helpful boundaries. For me, how might we questions help me ask big questions. I'm a process person. I think I prefer detail over big picture, but how might we questions help me ask those bigger questions? Things like, how might we be a church that's addressing loneliness? Or how might we be a church that shares the good news for today? So I've got one last task for you, and that's in Slido, and that's to think of an insight you've heard while you've been here today or yesterday. That can be anything that you've heard today or yesterday in a workshop, in a keynote, in conversation with a friend that's been said, and then make it into a how might we statement. So think of an insight you've already heard this weekend and turn it into a how might we question. That could be as simple as putting the how might we phrase on the front of your insight. So go ahead and do that in Slido. This one requires a little more, maybe. How might we connect people? How might we expand the we? Yeah, that's a question I was thinking about after yesterday. How might we support parents? How might we experience community in our everyday? How might we increase our communication in congregations so people understand why they worship? That's a good one. How might we address white Christian nationalism in a way faithful to the gospel? How might we talk about grief and supporting grieving people? So these questions, as you go from this place, can be the starting point for your next idea. They can help you generate as many ideas as possible in response to these how might we questions. So that's just a quick tool from the design thinking toolkit. So I'm going to conclude and give you your takeaways. One is to think about the ways that you are a designer, the things that you design in your own context. What are they? How does being a designer help you think about them differently? Second, start with empathy. Who are you talking to this week? Who should you be talking to? What do you want to learn from them? Thirdly, try something new, and that something new can be something really, really small. 4, remember we have an abundant God, and that's always true, today, tomorrow, and in the past. And lastly, don't be afraid to ask, how might we? And if you'd like to keep in touch with me or the ELCA Innovation Lab, you can email lab@elca.org, or find us online, or follow us on Instagram at ELCA Innovation. Thank you so much for allowing me to share my time with you this morning.
Thank you, Ian. We know a little bit more about the Innovation Lab now, don't we? In just a few minutes, we will be moving to our workshops. Our workshops will begin at 11:15. We've moved the schedule a little bit. And we will have a 30-minute break there for, if I hurry up right here and now, to to get to your workshops and get things started. Synod staff and the gathering team will be available to guide you to the right classroom. All of the workshops will be in the Rhine building. Snacks will be available, this is important, just outside the P.E. Monroe auditorium and in the Rhine building. We thank Lutheran Men in Mission and the Home Mission Foundation for providing snacks at this break today. A note about the afternoon, we will have several affinity group lunches. They are noted. I thought they would be on the slide. I can't see them from here. Okay. You can find them. You will find them, and you might already know about them. If you are not joining one of the affinity groups for lunch, just simply enjoy your lunch at the Cromer Center. Our afternoon workshops will follow lunch, and then we will gather back here at 3:15 for many celebrations and worship with Luther Ridge and Luther Rock staff. I hope you heard, I heard my mic come on. I hope you heard everything I said before then. 12:15, the workshops will begin. We've adjusted the schedule by 15 minutes.